Good afternoon, Para Wesley Bible Studiers. Hello, Stella. Hello, George. Glad to see that you are there and online. I'm not talking to myself. And today we are heading into Zechariah 12. I'm just realizing that we're nearly at the end of Zechariah 12, 13, and 14, and then we're done. Today was a bit of a day of rabbit holes for me as I went exploring, and I'm not sure, I might have eliminated so many rabbit holes that this becomes very short study. If so, then I'm sorry, and we will just have to catch up in the session afterwards with everybody's thoughts and comments. Let's go through Zechariah 12. Hello, honey. Glad you are there, and hopefully Ben and Angela are coming in as well. I'm going to bring the text up on the screen, but I'm not sure that it's very easy to read. So please feel free to follow in your own Bibles, and also know how easily the texts differ depending on which version that you're looking at. But if we go through Zechariah 12, starting at the beginning, a prophecy, the word of the Lord concerning Israel, or this is the word of the Lord about Israel. The Lord who stretches out the heavens, who lays the foundations of the earth, and who forms the human spirit within a person. That is a very interesting way of introducing himself, whereas he gives the great vastness first to say this is the God who made the heavens, that part of the universe that is beyond our understanding, the God that made the earth, this place that we live on, the place that we know well as we know the area that we live, and then the God who made the human spirit inside of us. So the very one who made us ourselves. It's quite interesting, the thought of making the human spirit, as he is getting beyond the idea of God made people, but that he makes the life inside of us. He makes the essence of who we are. He makes that thing in us that does not die but lives forever, and is probably a reflection back to Genesis in the beginning, where God breathed life into Adam. And so we have the breath of life in us. And then, of course, let me bring up that passage again. It is echoed then in verse 10, and I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and supplication. And so there is almost certainly the sense that this is the God who forms the spirit. He made us, he made that bit inside of us, and because of that, he is the God that is able to send a spirit on us, who is able to guide the innermost part of us, not only external circumstances, but that he is able to change us. I guess getting to the Jeremiah 31 sort of thing of a new heart and a new spirit within us. So that may look like just a little introduction that God makes of himself there, but it's fairly profound just in those three phrases. Okay, so this is what God says. I am going to make Jerusalem a cup that sends all the surrounding peoples reeling. That idea of reeling gives us the idea of staggering around in an uncontrolled manner, and we know the idea of the cup of wrath. And so when God says he's going to make Jerusalem a cup of the wrath of God, that is going to make the people drunk on God's anger, and he's going to defeat them in that way. So it's sort of a metaphorical, I guess, way of putting it. I'm going to take us, and I think I'll do it after we've gone through the passage. I'm going to take us to Revelation chapter 16, where it speaks about the bowls that the angels pour out of the wrath of God. But I think I'll save that until we've gone through the whole of Zechariah 12. So we'll go there just now. And also to be aware of the fact that Jesus had a cup, well, in two instances, the cup of the communion at the Last Supper, where he said, this is my blood given for you. And then the cup in the Garden of Gethsemane, where he says, Lord, let this cup be taken from me. And it doesn't say in that context that it is the cup of God's wrath. But when we do understand Jesus in some way taking our punishment, then yeah, perhaps he did have to drink the cup of God's wrath. That's something that people can have quite big theological debates about, but certainly we can see the resonance with the word cup further on there. As we said last week, prophecies have all sorts of different times of fulfillment. That sometimes here Zechariah refers to the past, sometimes to his immediate present, to the messianic when Jesus comes, and to the eschatological, the end times. This particular chapter is, I think it's difficult to find exactly which refers to where, when. Because I guess we know that Jerusalem doesn't stand as a unconquerable nation right now, as an unconquerable city. And so we're trying to put it together to when does Jerusalem refer to the city of Jerusalem? When does it actually refer to the people of God, perhaps? I think also as we go through that, we'll expand on it a little bit. But I think basically for Zechariah, just the promise that Jerusalem would be strong and that the nations would be sent reeling. And so if we carry on with the passage there, it says, Judah will be besieged as well as Jerusalem. On that day, when all the nations of the earth are gathered against her, and this one here we're going to pick up again in Revelation 16, I will make Jerusalem an immovable rock for all the nations. Okay, that imagery I think is easy for us to understand. Big, strong, solid, nobody can conquer, nobody can overcome. All who try to move it will injure themselves. And again, a bit of an echo to Revelation 16. Well, Revelation 16 echoes this. We'll pick that up just now. On that day I will strike every horse with panic and its rider with madness, declares the Lord. I will keep a watchful eye over Judah, but I will blind all the horses of the nations. There are echoes back to the curses promised on the Israelites in Deuteronomy there. There are echoes to the various times when God defeated the Arameans by sending panic and confusion on them and making them blind and unable to see. It may just be that this is an image that says that God will confuse the enemy, that God will triumph. The enemy is just going to be totally lost in the power of God and in the power of his people. But that is also interesting to say, well, maybe it is matching back to the essence of Deuteronomy, where Moses tells the people, watch out, all these things will happen to you. And maybe it does pick up the passages we read about in Kings with the Arameans, who are also fought off in this way. But essentially, it means God promises confusion to his enemies. Then the clans of Judah will say in their hearts, the people of Jerusalem are strong, because the Lord Almighty is their God. Apparently, as with much of Zechariah, that word clans of Judah there is awkward to translate, and so my commentator says we should call it the leaders of Judah or the princes of Judah. I'm not sure that it really makes very much difference to our understanding. The clans of Judah will say in their hearts, the people of Jerusalem are strong, because the Lord Almighty is their God. All the way through this, we've got an interesting way of relating Jerusalem and Judah. In other parts of Zechariah, there's been this very clear part of Jerusalem kind of being in the middle and Judah being the surrounding area, and that God incorporated them all, perhaps starting in Jerusalem and going out to Judea. But somehow there's just something very odd about the way we keep shifting between Judah and Jerusalem, and they don't seem to actually be dealt with in the same way. Now, this is a rabbit hole that I couldn't really finish climbing down. But I was wondering if it's at all possible that Judah here could actually represent the Gentiles. And so instead of our normal understanding, and this would be unusual, it's not something you really see in Scripture, which is why I need to think about it a lot more, but I'm putting it out there for everybody to think about. That if Judah in this passage, as we go on eschatologically and messianically, If Judah is the Gentiles, Jerusalem is the Jews, and the house of David is God. It just makes it make a little bit more sense. So I'm just putting that out there to think about it. So the clans of Judah will say in their hearts, okay, so now it's maybe the Gentiles. The people of Jerusalem are strong. The Jews are strong because the Lord Almighty is their God. And again, there's the whole thing open with what is going to happen to the Jews that don't believe in Jesus. Are they going to be saved in the end? This passage is just, yeah, it's really full of that kind of stuff. We can see in this passage how the Jewish people, the Israeli nation, can be so passionate about keeping Jerusalem whole, as to say how important this is because of these prophecies, like we see here in Zechariah. Okay, let me stop dithering about this. And then God goes on to say in verse 6, on that day I will make the clans of Judah like a fire pot in a wood pile, like a flaming torch among sheaves. They will consume all the surrounding peoples right and left, but Jerusalem will remain intact in her place. Okay, I think we understand the imagery, which is very powerful, the imagery of a fire and a flame, and of how that will go out and will destroy. Again, the Judah Jerusalem thing, a little bit awkward, not too sure what it meant. For Zechariah, I guess it would have been pretty straightforward. He's saying the people of Judah will be the front line of any attack. Jerusalem is nestled inside in the safety of Judah. Perhaps that could also be what it is. But yes, this imagery, this promise. So essentially for Zechariah, reassuring and encouraging. For us, yeah, what does it mean? What is it saying about Jesus? What is it saying about the end times? And then as we go into verse 7, the Lord will save the dwellings of Judah first, so that the honor of the house of David and of Jerusalem's inhabitants may not be greater than that of Judah. Now you see, there's something rather strange there. I'm not quite sure. This is why I'm starting to think, well, maybe as we look into this eschatologically, we should be looking at the nations, the Gentiles. On that day, verse 8, and I should have mentioned, we've got this on that day all the way through, but that is very much a apocalyptic sort of statement. When the prophets talk about on that day, it points either to the Messianic era or to the eschatological era, to say that, you know, in that time when Jesus comes the first time, that time when Jesus comes again, on that day is very distinctive in the Old Testament because of that. Verse 8, on that day the Lord will shield those who live in Jerusalem, so that the feeblest among them will be like David, and the house of David will be like God, like the angel of the Lord going before them. On that day I will set out to destroy all the nations that attack Jerusalem. So in many ways that is straightforward. It is saying the same thing. Jerusalem will be defended. Judah, the house of David, Jerusalem itself will be strong in a very special way. As it talks about the house of David will be like God, will be like the angel of the Lord, very much messianic, very much we see a pointer there to Jesus. How Zechariah would have seen it, perhaps he thought it pointed to Zerubbabel, perhaps he thought that there would be a literal angel that came down like it did for Joshua and other times in the Bible. Very difficult to tell. But yeah, an interesting construction, not as straightforward as some of the passages that we read, but very interesting to see this relation between Judah, Jerusalem, and the house of David. Then we take a big change in direction as we go into verse 10. And this, of course, we all identify. We know this as messianic. I was reading my commentary, who was being very slow to get to the messianic part, and I thought, gosh, I wonder why it's being so slow. Do they not see it? But of course, my commentary was trying to see how this made sense for Zechariah, because it must have made sense. Verse 10, and I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and supplication. That spirit of grace and supplication, perhaps not entirely the way we would see grace in the New Testament sense. The root of both words, grace and supplication, apparently both mean something to do with a request for mercy, a desire for relationship. And so we do see grace in there, but it's a sense of crying out to God. So I guess that's what we're looking at, a spirit of crying out to God. We don't know if that is spirit, capital S, or if it's just a spirit of an inclination within us, but it is interesting how it goes back to verse 1 or to verse 2, whichever it was, which spoke of the spirit at the beginning there. And then they will look on me, the one they have pierced. And there we know that in John's Gospel, it particularly says that in this way the scripture was fulfilled, that they will look on him who was pierced, when Jesus had the spear pierced his side on the cross. And then Revelation chapter 1 also says that when Jesus comes again, everybody will see him, even those who pierced him. They will mourn for him as one mourns for an only child, and grieve bitterly for him as one grieves for a firstborn son. We know that those that followed Jesus mourned bitterly at that time, and in due course, all who were involved in rejecting Jesus will mourn as they understand and realize what has happened. An only child, a firstborn son, of course, also reflects onto the Son of God. Verse 11, on that day the weeping in Jerusalem will be as great as the weeping of Hadad Rimmon in the plain of Megiddo. I'm going to show us Megiddo just now. Hadad Rimmon is a mystery for the translators. I mean, they know it's translated Hadad Rimmon. They know that Hadad Rimmon is the Syrian name for Baal, which is the storm god. And so I guess the weeping of the storm god might just be rain. Not entirely clear what they had in mind. I think many of the study Bibles will say that it might have been the place on the plains of Megiddo where Josiah was killed. In fact, let me just go and show you now the map. So there on the map, you can see where Megiddo is. You could get your context by finding the Dead Sea there, and there's the Sea of Galilee. This here is the tribe of Manasseh on this particular map, and here is Megiddo. So this area here where we see Manasseh is actually Samaria in the time of Jesus. Judah is this part to the west of the Dead Sea, and Galilee up to the west of the Sea of Galilee. But there is Megiddo. And Megiddo was a town on a major passageway between the north and the south. And so we read in 2 Kings of how Pharaoh Necho wanted to come and attack the king of Assyria, that was the current ruler, and King Josiah of Judah decided to go help him and ended up dying there at Megiddo. And the commentators say perhaps that's what it means when it says the tears for the death of good King Josiah, as he died in that useless way against Pharaoh Necho. So it could be that, it could be other things. I think I will talk a little bit more about Megiddo later, but also just to say that Megiddo is no longer there. It was destroyed in the time of the Persian emperor, when the Persian Empire took over. What is left is a massive archaeological mound, which they call a tell, and apparently 35 layers of settlements inside that mound. 35 different times that the city of Megiddo was rebuilt, dating back probably to about 8000 BC, but then was destroyed in the Persian Empire, and that was the end of it. Right, I'm now taking longer than I intended rather than shorter. Let me go back to the text if I can find it. There we go. The land will mourn, each clan by itself, with their wives by themselves. The clan of the house of David and their wives, the clan of the house of Nathan and their wives, the clan of the house of Levi and their wives, the clan of Shimei and their wives, and all the rest of the clans and their wives. Very interesting that the clans there, David and Nathan would have been probably the son of David, both of the tribe of Judah, and Levi and Shimei, his grandson of the tribe of Levi, which is all these reflections back to the priest king, to Melchizedek. So there's a whole direction that we could go, but we won't take that rabbit hole now. I just very briefly want us to look at Revelation 16. If I can just push the right buttons here. After this I looked, and I saw in the heaven the temple, that is the tabernacle of the covenant, and it was opened. Out of the temple came the 7 angels with the 7 plagues. They were dressed in clean, shining linen, and wore golden sashes round their chests. And one of the 4 living creatures gave to the 7 angels 7 golden bowls, filled with the wrath of God, who lives forever and ever. And the temple was filled with smoke from the glory of God and from his power, and no one could enter the temple until the 7 plagues of the 7 angels were completed. Okay, that's actually the end of Revelation 15. The golden bowls of wrath, reflecting back the cup of wrath. Okay, I'm not going to read all of this as we go. In fact, I've left a whole lot even off the slide, and that is all the different plagues that come with the different bowls. So we get to the 6th bowl that dries up the river Euphrates so that the kings can come from the east. And they send out the 3 frogs, which are going to gather the armies. And so it's a reflection back to Zechariah when we talk about the kings coming to try and conquer Jerusalem. Then verse 16, then they gathered the kings together to the place that in Hebrew is called Armageddon. Okay, Armageddon comes from the Hebrew Har Megiddo, the Mount of Megiddo. And so there again we have our friend Armageddon from Zechariah. Megiddo, Armageddon. And then the 7th bowl comes, and there's earthquakes and dramatic stuff, and the great city Babylon is split into 3 parts and is never remembered anymore. 40 kilograms of hail, huge hailstones of 40 kilograms fell on the people, and they cursed God on account of the plague of hail because the plague was so terrible. Okay, I'm sort of laughing as I read this because it is such a disastrous thing. But gosh, if we have to live through that time, I don't know. But just very interesting to see how Zechariah clearly has an eschatological point, because we see the same eschatological message coming out in Revelation. So yeah, a challenge to see all the different meanings, but we really must stop now. We'll continue in Zoom. Anybody that wants to join us, just give us a couple of seconds and then click on the Zoom link and we will see you there. Thank you for watching. Thank you to those that watch later, and may God bless you all.